Yeah, I was actually writing pathway books, working with a guy or for a guy named Byron Price in New York, and I had always wanted to be a writer. I hooked up with him. I had done some comics for Heavy Metal and Playboy magazine, a few other things. Anyway, so I met Byron Price, and he was doing these variants on Choose Your Own Adventure. They were called Be an Interplanetary Spy. And so I wrote a couple of these books, and it was really the first introduction I had to like nonlinear storytelling, where you had to explode the story and have it head off in different directions. And he said, you know, I'm moving into software, and there's a great Arthur C. Clarke novel called Rendezvous with Rama, and would you like to adapt it? So that was my first introduction. With a couple of colleagues there, they said, you know, this is a great new art form. And I thought that was kind of a ridiculous statement. But I began to take this book and Rendezvous with Rama and dissect it and figure out what the elements were, almost like a formal analysis of the plot and the components in it, the characters, the objects, the mysteries, the unfolding of it. And so I got completely hooked in it. The only thing that was problematic about that was that even though the engineers were good guys, the system was extremely limited, and there were very few things that you could do with it. So, you know, it was really verb, noun, verb, noun, verb, noun, no indirect, you know, no adjectives even, and, you know, very little functionality in the objects in that world. You'd look at this and touch that, or push this and smell that. It was like that. So, given that I was really hooked on it, I thought, you know, if this is really an art form, like film, for example, then you'd really want to know how to create the entire work. And in filmmaking, you'd be able to understand how to work a camera, how to shoot, how to edit, how to really make the finished product. So for me, as a writer, I understood that I had to know how to program. So what I did was I tried to figure out, and like just about everybody else, we worship the Infocom work and we're just amazed by it. And I was amazed by it. And so I set my target, my goal was to do two things simultaneously. One, learn how to program so that I could, two, build a system, an interactive fiction system that was as good or better than Infocom's. And, you know, from there, that's really what set me on the path. And how I got there, so I just keep rolling. So it was great because I really knew nothing about software at all. I knew I loved the word software. That was, when I first heard the word software, I was just like, hardware? Software. And it just had such magic, this term, software. I was just absolutely enthralled by it. And so I began to get books about programming. I had played around with, you know, punch cards and things when I was a kid and being a proto geek in high school, but, you know, personal computers were something new, and I had an Atari 800 computer. And I had a 400 at one point, but the 800 was the one I did most of my work on. One of my colleagues from Byron Price, a guy who wrote some of the other Choose Your Own Adventure style books, the Time Machine series, he said, you know, there's a great programming language called Forth. And Forth is cool because you can basically write a language and then write your program in the language you created, which may sound indirect, but, you know, for anybody who has a programmer sensibility, the more control you have and the more you can really shape things in the way that you want them to be shaped, the better off you are. So I said, wow, that's a great idea. So this fellow I work with said, try the Forth programming language, and so I began to program in this language and figure out how it worked. I kind of hit the wall a little bit there. I was reading books, you know, algorithm plus data structure equals program. It became an obsession to really understand how to program. And the project, you know, rather than a hello world, it was a full-blown Infocom system that I was after. So there was a simultaneous kind of analysis of what Infocom was all about. You know, not really thinking, you know, this is something that they had built, but, you know, thinking that almost that system was something owned by the culture, not necessarily by a particular company. And so therefore it was completely okay for me to clone it, right? And then you get into the nuance and recognize where you could be just that little bit better, or a little bit smarter, or a richer world, or more detailed objects. So as I began to do this, I kind of reached out, and I met a fellow named Bill Hurdle, who was a chemist at Union Carbide and an amateur programmer, in the best sense of amateur. I mean, just really extraordinarily smart and capable. And he really taught me how to program and helped me through it, and we ended up partnering. And so the two of us eventually finished the trans fiction system parser. And it was an authoring system for creating interactive fiction. And we called it interactive fiction, not text adventures. And part of that is being a little bit grand about the medium and its possibilities, but part of it was, I think it was a more accurate term, it was interactive fiction as opposed to a text adventure, because it didn't necessarily have to be an adventure. Adventure is a genre of fiction. This was interactive fiction. And I started writing scenarios with it, and then I felt, I went back to Byron, and Byron kind of liked to own things, and didn't make sense, but I, hung the shingle out there and then hooked up with Simon and Schuster. And Simon and Schuster saw what we were doing, and almost at the same time, oddly enough, and I can't really remember the sequence here, the chronology, but Mark Blank, who was sort of a distant god in the Infocom universe, got a job at Simon and Schuster. He was like the editor-in-chief of interactive fiction, which is really quite amazing if you think about it, that Simon and Schuster was that forward-looking in terms of creating a new kind of fiction.
Simon and Schuster tried to buy Infocom.
Oh yeah? Is that how they met Mark?
In 1985.
Well, we had an editor at Simon and Schuster, and Deborah Weinberger, and she was responsible for kind of managing the process, but and she provided some editorial feedback, but it wasn't so much that we had an editor per se, or I think really what mostly they brought to the table, although there were some great people there, what they brought to the table was a license, because as they were trying to commercialize this, they thought, like a lot of people do, let's bring a property to the table, and they were able to bring Star Trek to the table. And so they said, can you build a Star Trek-based text adventure? Probably something they would have done with Infocom if Infocom had come across almost immediately. A great property. And we had really extraordinary freedom to create. It was really just a few people at that point in trans fiction systems. Really extraordinary freedom to design the story and write the story, because, partly because nobody really in Simon and Schuster understood how we were doing any of it. It's sort of like it was a fun factory, and they put in the Play-Doh and we pressed the button and out come all these interesting things, but they didn't know how that process worked at all. So, it's an old story, the programmers tend to have extraordinary control. In our case, we were sort of an odd company because we started as writers, and there were others that came at it from that direction, and then learned the programming. In other cases, we used to say that the people who built the stages are writing the plays. So we used to look down our nose at people who were technical, who had no sense of what story was all about, attempting to use this medium, which we thought would really redefine fiction. And we really believed that. So you had people who were technical trying to write stories. We thought really it has to come the other way. And the technology is in the service of the story and the characters and the richness of the world. So we didn't. So what they brought to the table was a property, financing, which really wasn't very much. It was under $100,000 to build something like that, and the marketing, and it was all together just a really good experience. And the first one we did was called Promethean Prophecy, and it was just really a blast to build that. But building the parser and the system itself was also fascinating for us, because you start. I don't know, should I just go wherever?
Go wherever you go.
Okay. So you kind of, when you have an interactive fiction system, it's different than ordinary fiction in a lot of different ways because you want to build a world that is rich. And what that means is you start veering over into simulation. And this is one of the great sort of, I think, pursuits for anybody who is involved in the medium. Maybe not anybody or everybody, but certainly for a number of us, was to think of how far can you understood how much that experience, that reader and user was, how much of that experience was really, a machine, a kind of Rube Goldberg machine of storytelling that had all these buttons and flashing lights and funny mechanisms that were popping off, when certain triggers were triggered. How much of that was really controlled? I mean, it's like a funhouse ride, or at the amusement park. You're on rails. You really are on rails, and to a large part. And you can sort of travel off to these tributaries, but you're still ultimately on rails. And that's why you can have a walkthrough, right? So there are only a few things that you can really do there. You can make more of these tributaries. A friend of mine came up with, and collaborator came up with the term refluent. It flowed back into itself. But ultimately, you come back to the main line in order to get to the end. So the more you could veer into simulation where systems were operating based upon other principles and weren't really, hardwired machines that, what we call Coke machine interactivity. You press Coke and out comes Coke. You press Fanta, out comes Fanta. You wanted to press Coke and it would think about what to do next and maybe surprise you. So we're always trying to figure out how do you break out of that, heavily authored nature of the system. So part of that was in objects and how much you could build into the objects. And you began to I remember I had a great experience, which I couldn't really use in a story. I guess I could have, but I didn't. That the nature of the way you implemented something might make it possible for it to surprise you. So, for example, I created a box, and there were objects. Person was a mobile talking container, in terms of the system. But you could also have a container. A container was something that something else could be inside of, and you end up with a linked list of things that are inside of things. Well, when I had designed, an object that was a container, I created the red box. I had also the ability to take the red box and put it in something else, and then an object could contain something. And I hadn't, and in order to figure out, and this is where it became fascinating. I mean, moving away from story in a way, but into the simulation aspects of it that really, queued up a lot of the things that I did afterwards. I would take one item and put it in another. That item could be put in a third, and so on. And at one point, I took the red box, and just to try it out, I said, put the red box in the red box. And so I put the red box in the red box. And then I said, look in the red box. And it said, in the red box, there is a red box. And the way it worked is it would keep looking, into the nested objects and containered objects and say, and then in the red box, there is a red box. And in the red box, there is a red box. And it went into this sort of infinite loop. And it was things like that really made me begin to think that, what you want to do is create things that have dynamics and that can really surprise you. And then from there, I got much more into something called narrative simulation, where we were attempting to build characters and objects that were full of potential, but would react to the world. And the goal always was for them to surprise you and to have more life. I'm not sure we ever really got there. And ultimately we realized that you need to have people, connected in networked worlds to really get there. But it was something that we tried to do with characters as well. In fact, we had a party in a nightclub and to introduce Rendezvous with Rama, and we had a message from Arthur C. Clarke in video. It was at a nightclub called Danceteria, to the people of Danceteria, about this text adventure and marvelous new medium. It was a fun experience. With Arthur C. Clarke, we didn't really get that much. He was sort of like blessed it, and we would run things by him. It was never clear how much he was really understanding what was going on with it, or how much he was really digging into it, because again, it was kind of an odd medium. But I would say that we were working within the constraints of the author's style and approach. So to some extent, you're mimicking how the author might think about something, or how they might do something. I'll tell you though, I can tell you that it wasn't, with great joy that we were working with these properties. There was something soulless about working with a big property owned by a conglomerate. Even though we might love Spock, it's still a property. And there are brand police, more than authors. In the case of Star Trek, at Simon and Schuster, the brand police. So the brand police had to kind of review everything that Spock might say or do. We would, extend the world and try to introduce new aspects of the history of these characters, but they'd have to sign off on it. So we didn't like that. And at the same time, for kind of a contract programming, game company, not Infocom, which had been able to sort of define the category and do their own original work, we're always getting hit with properties, right? We were always creating original works, but not necessarily getting the money to do them, because we were making a living doing this. It was nothing else. We were just making interactive fiction. We had this idea that and I certainly paid the bills with it. So we always had that kind of commercial pressure to do license deals. So I decided I'm going to go out and get my own license and see if I can make it fly. And I was working with Electronic Arts, and this project never came to fruition. It just kind of exploded. But I had met the people who worked with and edited and managed William Burroughs, and I was really, a big fan of, if fan is the word, but I was quite amazed by William Burroughs' work. And I said how great it would be to take something like a William Burroughs novel and render it as interactive fiction. So there was a now notorious and famous literary agent, Andrew Wiley, and he represented Burroughs, and there was a fellow named James Grauerholtz, who I had known through the nightclub business that I'd been involved with for a while. And so I licensed Nova Express by William Burroughs, and Electronic Arts entered into a contract with us to turn it into a graphical interactive storytelling. And it was the craziest experience I'd had, because it was really just like an idea, but the reality of actually trying to take William Burroughs' work, and one of the reasons I really liked his work so much and saw it as interesting is because he was a nonlinear storyteller in a linear form. And, he had famously worked with Byron Geisen on, cut-ups and, kind of rearranging pieces randomly to create a new work of art. One of the original mashup artists. And so he was mashing things up on the page. And I started decomposing Nova Express, and it was profane and hallucinatory kind of work, and it just got to the point where it collapsed under its own weight, and the project got canceled, and it was sort of a big disaster. But it was, it was worth trying. Even if we had done everything we wanted to do with it, I don't see how they could have shipped it. Because of the nature of the story. So anyway, that was one of the oddest kind of authorial experiences there. Kind of where we went as well in original work, and myself and a few collaborators, was on this narrative simulation approach. So we took a lot of what we had learned there and built something called Hidden Agenda. And Hidden Agenda modeled a post-revolutionary Central American country where you play the role of the president and appoint cabinet members and then try to run this post-revolutionary country. There was a fellow named Jim Gasparini. It was his original idea, and he had the expertise in that world. I produced it, did the game system with another fellow named Greg Guerin. Anyway, long story short, that was really sort of a legendary game in its own right, and it was original, but there was story there, but it was more, since it was more simulation, it was less about individual characters. The characters were really symbols for parts of this culture and this society. Yeah, so I mean, even then we understood that. I mean, if you can ask yourself now, if the reason it really never developed as a medium because there was really, well, I guess there's a lot of reasons. One is, people are hungry for sensation and experience, and so if text is good, then text and graphics is better, and if graphics are good, then 3D graphics graphics are better still, and if that's good, then networked is good, and if networked is good, massively multiplayer is better. So the nature of the experience is continually expanding in terms of the richness, the graphical richness. All of that costs money, and so I mean, people are still fighting this battle today. Where is the indie game business? I mean, almost every other medium has an indie model. There are a few people who are indie game creators, but very few of them. If you define the interactive fiction medium as text adventures, then you can say brief, flash in the pan. If you define the medium as one that, like every other medium, evolves over time and through the collaboration and recombination of things from a variety of creators, that medium never died. That medium has just evolved, it's become richer, it's become more important, and it's eclipsing Hollywood. So that's my view. In some of the comparisons, I remember sitting with Mark Blank when I had that meeting at Simon and Schuster, and I wanted to show him how my parser was better than his. But it was a parser wars, right? How our parser was better than Infocom's parser. I believe it had to do with multiple indirect objects and the way, something that would be almost meaningless, to everyone else. But the fact that you could put things inside of things, or take the book and give it to Bella and ask Bella about the book and also the candle, and being able to construct a very compound sentence with multiple clauses really in it was a big part of the richness we thought of the parser, because it made for, I was rooting back into that highly limited verb-noun, parser that I worked with in Rendezvous with Rama. It's like, the more natural the language that I could get a response with, the better the system would be. So it was things like that. There was richness in the objects, I believe, that wasn't in the Infocom system. The characters, I thought, were smarter. The characters were capable of, chronologically kind of deciding to do things in ways that seemed a little bit richer. So I think in retrospect, all this seems sort of incremental and really esoteric. But to people who were in that world at one point, I mean, these were really crucial differences. I had to get, if I recall, Mark said, yeah, that does work better. And, so it made my day. Right. Well, in thinking about why I would focus on text adventures and get so wrapped up in it, I'm not sure that I didn't start thinking, hey, here's a great field to make a living in. I did see that it was possible to make a living because the expertise in having a working interactive fiction system meant that you could get deals and actually build this stuff. The reason that I got so wrapped up in it is because I had been a writer, I had been an aspiring writer, and to me the medium itself, writing is difficult. It's hard to make money writing. Very few writers actually get paid. And I had some things published, and I was lucky enough to get things published. There was always that pressure of, sort of doing potboiler type work. But I thought that I could really combine, my desire to really deeply become deeply involved in writing fiction, and at the same time, be able to actually make a living at it, because you were changing all the rules about, just breaking free of the page. The richness and the possibility for storytelling was enormous, I thought. And so if we had to make compromises and, do licensed work, Well, fine, because the medium and the evolution of medium was the most important thing, right? And these are steps along the way. The reality is it never, in its original form, really panned out as something that we thought would, sort of live forever in that form, in quite the way I imagined. But yeah, I think the reason that I decided that it made sense to focus on it is because it was a real sort of playground and petri dish, to really experiment with fiction, to understand what fiction was all about, and to do it in a way that allowed me to do it exclusively, not have to do other things. I could think about writing. I'd be surprised if anybody looked at interactive fiction back in those days and text adventures as, hey, here's a great new field that I can get into and earn good money and retire someday. I think people got into it, as I got into it, because they were fascinated by it. And they were fascinated by its possibilities, and adored what other people were doing. I mean, the Infocom work was just extraordinary, and so entertaining and deep, and in my view. So it was really for the love of it. Primarily, because there's other ways to make money, but there are very few that combine so many of your passions in one package. I don't know. I think maybe one of the things that I remember, and part of it is the effects of youth, is just how important we thought it was. I mean, I thought it was, and the people that I work with, it's just powerful new medium. You look at people who had, I looked at contemporary fiction, and people writing 0 degree fiction, where the word they were trying to not convey narrative in any sense. And then you look at interactive fiction, and it just blew out it just so fundamentally changed things to have the reader be the protagonist. So I remember trying to figure out, what is the how would you describe it when the manner of speech where you're always saying you do this and you do that and you see this and you see that. I mean, I remember seeing somebody pick that up. It might have been Jay McInerney, I think, in Bright Lights, Big City, and thinking. Yeah, I think it was in the opening chapter. He used what somebody called the vocative case. You wake up. It's 5 in the morning, and you're in a nightclub, and you leave the nightclub, and you find some bread on the street, and somebody threw away a coat, and it was all you. And I said, wow, he just picked this up from interactive fiction, and this is a real kind of change. When people are writing stories and talking to the user as if they are the protagonist. So I sort of remember that, and I think it really was a real kind of turning point for people's experience of media, where they're at the center of it. It's funny. It's a form of for me, writing those stories and designing those, since you're really composing a machine. It's really that Rube Goldberg machine notion of storytelling, with all these objects and things and interactions between them and so on. And so it's a funny thing, because you're writing a program. The story really is a program, right? In the form of a story. And so you would introduce bugs into your story, places where, you can't get there from here, and you have to, or there's some linkage that's missing, or some object didn't function as required. And it's funny, because it would be as if you had a program, but the program was made of characters and objects, and it's a program. That story is a program. And so when you had a bug in the program, it would come out as some crazy story dead end. And so it was so closely coupled to writing programs. And I guess I remember trying to debug these things. And, just before CES, and you have to finish something, and you've got a bug in your story. And the bug in your story is because there's a bug in your program, and you can't see it. And I remember once I was working for like 24 hours straight trying to debug the story and figure out, is the bug in the story or in the program? Or is it the structure, the way I've structured this thing, or is it somewhere I've encoded something? Or it turned out I created two identically named variables, and the way the system compiled them, the first instance was being written to, and I was interrogating the second instance. I just couldn't see that. And I began to get mystical, and I realized that the same flaw in my thought processes that allowed me to introduce this bug, which was expressed in a weird way in the story, were the same processes that made it impossible or difficult for me to see the bug and debug it. And so it's just like the story. The interactive fiction required you to look at a set of objects, a set of characters and situations, and then somehow pop outside of your frame of reference so that you can see it in a different way and get the solution and figure out how to get through that door. So, it's that closeness, how much the storytelling is like the programming, is like, the functioning of a program, how closely allied the medium is to its technical underpinnings. And that's one of the things that, I don't know if that'll ever be fully understood by people who didn't create those stories.